let's call the meeting to order and have a roll call.
Trustee Hallwax. Here. Trustee Listener. Here. Trustee Mulvaney. Trustee Onderdunk.
Here.
Trustee Rubin.
Here.
Trustee Breed.
Here.
President Rowan.
Here. We are live streaming this meeting and have posted the links to the live stream on the Village's social media pages. We'll make the recording available on the Village's YouTube channel following the conclusion of tonight's meeting. I want to remind everyone, it seems like there's a lot of space, but if you feel like you're getting close to somebody, masks are encouraged but not required, and we have extra masks just outside the council chamber. This next item on the agenda is public comment. This portion of the meeting allows for those in attendance to address the board regarding non-agenda items. I'll request public comments that relate to agenda items when we reach that item on the agenda. All comments should be limited to 3 minutes, and I'll tell you when your time is up. Any public comments on issues not on the agenda? You know, we have a big crowd here, so. Okay, there are none of those. So the next item on the agenda is discussion of residential street lighting in the village of Glencoe, and I'll ask that our Public Works Director, Dave Mao, present. Dave.
Thank you. Good evening. Ooh, hot mic. We're back tonight. We last talked about this in January, as you may recall, when the board received a preliminary report from staff on the existing street lighting infrastructure in the village. And we brought to your attention then that we had not, the existing street light network in the village has not changed substantially in the last 30 years. We've had a few one-off installations, but more and more we're getting inquiries and requests for specific locations. And as we've noted previously, the last 2 village community surveys, this has been a topic that's been raised by survey participants for the adequacy, that the board would prioritize the adequacy of street lighting in residential areas in the coming years for whatever that means to the current board. So following the discussion back in January, staff was directed to kind of move forward in the development of a draft policy. This has been a process in the works, and because of some other priorities, we're now in August, but we're bringing this back tonight for some continued discussion and input from the board. It was further suggested in developing that draft policy that the staff consider avoiding light pollution, which is an issue front of mind in the lighting world, as well as including appropriate fixtures and shielding to limit the illumination of streetlights to within the right-of-way only, which again is also kind of a key design element in today's lighting design world. So staff set out with the goal of developing a management plan and policy that could be used to help guide the decision-making, planning, and operational installation of lighting in the next, I think we noted here, 5 to 10 years, but it's really been a longer period than that. The village's streetlights, as hopefully you found the information in the packet helpful, breaks into a number of categories, but we're really focused on here is the residential part of the community, and we've got nearly 400 ComEd provided and supported lights within the village's network. And this map, while it's small in scale, is meant to at least demonstrate we've got coverage village-wide, but we do have some key gaps at locations that we think warrant at least a discussion and some direction as we go forward. Again, up till now, we've had no formal policy or plan, so staff has kind of had to operate on a wing and a prayer. Yes?
This is just ComEd streetlights?
Correct. So you don't see the lights and the heights and ridges on this map. Trustee Hallwax is maybe.
Wait a minute. We didn't have it, but now we do.
If you look in the packet, we had separated the different areas, and there's some 60 lights, and they're a different type of light up in the heights and ridges. There's a couple members of the trustees present that know those lights all too well. So we've got so we've got 380 plus lights, but we've got gaps at many intersections in town, and a lot of the street end cul-de-sacs. So staff recommends moving toward a set of standards that would provide for at least a street light at every street intersection in the village, and at the end of street cul-de-sacs and hammerheads, formalized street ends. It's not going to apply in all locations, but at least to have a policy and a plan that those would be evaluated. And then even certain intermediate points that might be mid-block on longer block faces. We've got some blocks in town, Greenwood, Grove, and Bluff are good examples south of Dundee that are extremely long, and so they may warrant an intermediate light mid-block as opposed to just at the intersections. Resident requests for new street lights that are outside of adopted set of standards, could be evaluated by staff as well, but given a lower priority. An important consideration with the development of the plan was looking at cost, and our best estimate in talking with ComEd and our own experiences, if we're looking at a standard street light installation, the ComEd wood pole with the standard fixture and an armature on it is about $10,000, but that number could greatly fluctuate depending on if the decision is made that all service to those street lights would be underground and not involve any overhead. If ComEd offers alternate pole designs, concrete poles, more decorative pole, and even different fixtures, but those are just going to be a different cost. So we're estimating the $10,000 is kind of a planning number. In looking at the existing conditions map, we would estimate conservative. We have probably anywhere from 35 to 45 locations right off the bat just to complete intersections and street end cul-de-sacs in town. So right away we're looking at, in today's dollars, what could be $500,000 plus of street light improvements. It would not be staff's recommendation. That would be done in a single phase, obviously, but this would help for the planning purposes as we look ahead in the CIP. If there's a decision made to have a formal program, and we think that's warranted to at least have the conversation going forward. As you recall, we did include some dollars in the most recently passed referendum for streetlight improvements. And there are some locations in town, and we'll talk about it twice tonight, but the Old Elm Lane neighborhood east of Sheridan, north of Takeoff Center, or excuse me, east of Green Bay and north of Takeoff, has one streetlight in it. And the rest of it is dark. Now, for every resident that supports street lighting in that in a neighborhood like that or a subdivision like that, there's one or two that probably feel differently. And so there's those kind of issues that are going to have to be evaluated in the implementation of a policy and a plan. So I think before you tonight is at least the draft of a plan to start to begin to have a conversation on what the purposes and goals of a management plan would be, and then our recommended layout, which again would be street intersections and cul-de-sacs and street ends, would be a starting point. Got a couple residents that are contacting our office on a every other month basis, wanting street lights mid-block in front of an individual house for individual, for more site-specific concerns, and those may or may not have validity. But as I said, I think from staff's perspective, we would recommend we could evaluate those, but they may be on a lower priority than what we believe would be more pressing need would be intersections and locations of high traffic, either and other factors that would weigh into that is the presence or lack of a presence of sidewalk, certainly an element, and then proximity to schools and houses of worship in the downtown area. And we don't have a lot of that gaps in the lighting network there, but there are some. So that's kind of a thumbnail overview. Wanting to hear some dialogue on if the board sees the value in us pursuing finalizing a policy that we would begin to implement. And so I've got next steps on here. that we begin to work on some of the steps outlined in here. There would need to be a process in here for residents. Right now, it's a phone call, and it's very informal, and we would recommend if someone is requesting a specific location that they follow a process. You know, we've got some ideas, and we'll work through that administratively. And then as we move forward with a policy under our belt, to be able to begin to plan as we in the budget development process to build into the 10-year CIP some lighting improvements at whatever pace is reasonable from a funding perspective. So with that, I'd open it up for comments or questions.
I just have so residents who are requesting lights, what's typically their reason? Is it driving or?
It's usually, yeah, it's dark. It's very dark in front of my house, and yeah, it's generally pretty site specific. We've had a few requests though that fall into this category. We've got one over in town near Elm Place, where the intersection of Elm Place and Valley is absent a street light. So that one we think has great validity.
Are there government guidelines as to where you have a street light, or are there municipal engineer guidelines as to where you have a street light?
There are design standards, and as I noted in here, you know, new development, you'd see street lights on a much closer frequency, 300-400 feet apart. Harder to mesh that into a mature, developed community, particularly a tree, you know, with the tree canopy we have. But certainly, you know, the kinds of things we're talking about, street ends and intersections, would all fall within those kind of recommended guidelines, as well as acceptable lighting levels. There's a technical side to the photometric side to lighting design that we didn't go into great detail on this plan, but we would look to work with professionals in advising us on. Now the ComEd system, it's a little simpler on what they're going to provide. We have a range of, I don't want to get overly technical here, but the color of a light is controlled by the temperature of the light, and so when we converted, we worked with ComEd to be one of the first communities to convert to their LED lights. We settled on a lighting level, and that was used throughout the 380 lights that are in town. And generally, with few exceptions, and where we had concerns expressed, ComEd was able to go back in, and usually it was with, you know, I've got light shining in my front window now that I didn't have before, and so they were able to address those with shielding, and either at the fixture or even the position of the arm on the light. So by and large, since that installation, we have not had a lot of negative feedback. Conversely, a lot of positive feedback, because the lighting is much more consistent color and lighting levels throughout the village in the residential neighborhoods. The downtown commuter lots are a little bit different lighting levels.
Well, thank you for bringing this sound to us. It sounds like we should develop a plan. Let me ask one other question. So I can see intersections, street ends, parking lots, everybody sort of agrees there should be lights. It gets more difficult when somebody just says, I think there should be a light here, and it may be appropriate concern, or is there any? Are all of the, and where the village should pay for where everybody sort of agrees there should be a light? It's a different question when not everybody agrees. I wonder whether, is this always something the village pays 100%, or is there some sharing that's extra?
Well, up until now, there's not been any private participation in lighting that's gone in the public right of way. We have not. That has not been the case. Unlike potentially some sidewalk improvements where that's been a conversation. We've never developed a special service area for anything other than full-on street improvements to date. If you look back, there, you know, the subdivision ordinance, there'd be questions on how certain areas of the village were developed without street lighting, but you know, we haven't dug deep enough. I don't have a good answer for why we've got an entire subdivision with a single street light in it.
A quick couple of questions and comments. On Dundee, just driving through there, that seems kind of dark, and that's a major street. Is part of that is in the village, and part of that is under state control? Am I?
That's correct.
Yeah.
East of the Forestway, Hofelder intersection is local jurisdiction, is Glencoe. So only that section west of
Yeah, since that's
Forestway.
one of the major gateways, I'd like to encourage us to take a real special look at that for lighting. It carries a lot of traffic, and it's kind of narrow and twisty, and I think that'd be helpful to take a look at that. Now also wanted to say I'm glad we're taking a look at this and echo what I've heard earlier about some of this needs to be worked out with the neighbors. We don't need to have terribly high lighting levels throughout the whole community. A couple things to take a look at. One is the AASHTO standards, especially some of the latest standards related to LED. They're moving away from very, very high temperature LEDs to a little more cooler, and it turns out you actually see that better. You have less glare on that. I'm sure you can, and staff can take a look into that, but that's been brought to my attention. And then I think this is one of those things that we'll just need to fold into the capital improvements program and year by year chip away at it, and then perhaps have some special, I'll call it, exceptions for safety purposes. I don't know if this has led to any accidents in the community, due to poor lighting, but let's take a quick look at that too. Thank you.
Hi, yes, thanks. I want to reiterate some of the comments that we've discussed here at the board in years past, and that's the importance of good lighting design to protect night skies. So, a community that doesn't have streetlights may or may not be an oops. It may actually be very intentional for the preservation of night skies. So I purposely, for example, selected a mid-block house away from streetlights because I enjoy seeing stars at night when I come home. Right, so you lose that ability to see the night sky with more street lighting. Right, so light pollution. I also don't enjoy reading a book to the light of a street light. Right, so when I was living in the city, and I'm sure many of you experienced this, you could literally read a book without any lights on in your house because there's such a bright street light coming into my home. And that's light pollution, light trespass. So I just want to reiterate the importance of properly managing these fixtures and the design of the lighting to focus the light where your object is, right? We don't want any light going up because nobody's interested in lighting up the sky or the trees. Well, some people are interested in lighting up the trees in their house, but the intent of safety, the light is on the object that you're trying to see, right? So if I could just re-emphasize that, we've had that discussion a few times, super important. The notion of glare is also super important. When the streets are wet, I'm sure you've all been on very well, brightly lit streets, but when there's the streets are wet and slick, man, it's tough to see, right? Everything is just glare. The street can be as bright as the light bulb, right? Just about. So that is not safe, right? Adding more lights does not make it more safe, right? Adding good lighting makes it more safe.
Thank you. Anybody else? Like I said, I think it sounds like the board's ready to proceed with what's worked out. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would agree. I say the one thing I think we probably have to tread carefully on is this resident request policy. And I don't know how many lights we've installed over the years based on resident requests, but it can be, I think, it can be probably a
Very
little
few.
difficult. Okay.
And where we did, for example, this was years ago, without any policy, we made sure we had unanimous support from the immediate affected properties, because that could be a recipe for problems if we don't have that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm in complete agreement.
And we would look to have, again, on a lower priority, your staff firmly believes with the intersection locations are, and we've got many, those would take a priority to address first. But in these one-offs, if they have merit mid-block, they'd have merit based on any number of factors, taking into account, good lighting design. Then we'd have to, and we will, develop a plan to seek out, acceptance and confirmation from those properties affected. And what that number is, does it have to be unanimous? That we'll have to walk, work through that.
Right.
Is the only area with different lights the Heights and Ridge?
In the residential part of the community, yes.
Yeah. How did that start? I live there, so I'm curious how that would.
That would have been part of the subdivision. We have a subdivision on the agenda later tonight. That would have been a part of the subdivision approval for the Heights and Ridges. I don't have a great answer. I would tell you hasn't been a joy. There's been a number of challenges with the underground system that feeds it, and even though that's probably a good example, though that is not excessive lighting levels. It's very minimalist, and but we did update all those lights to at least uniform LED lighting levels, and I think that's helped, but that's anything but overlit up there. But it's also an area with minimal public sidewalk as well, as you know, and so you got people that are in the street, so take that into account.
Good segue.
With good lighting.
Okay, I think we covered residential lighting. So we're the policy. The next item on the agenda is policy discussion on construction use sidewalk. And the last one was on each side.
Well, yes and no, but I think it is, and the two are connected in some way as well. So the fact that they're on the same agenda, I think, is a good thing. So this should not be a new topic to anybody that's lived in town for any length of time. But looking back, the board recalls that the board adopted the active transportation plan in 2018, and that plan included a number of recommendations. Some of the key recommendations in that plan were proposed improvements on major corridors, as Trustee Donderdonk noted, and those, to include Dundee, Green Bay, and Sheridan. Proposed improvements to bike trails, bike facilities, and sidewalks and residential streets. And then proposed intersection improvements on major roads at key school and park crossings. A couple of comments. The first, the major corridor work, we have looked at that, and we've actually completed one of the recommended sidewalk gap locations on Dundee Road, at the west end of town between Pebblewood and the Botanic Garden entrance. That work was completed in 2020, and every day we see pedestrian and cycle use of that sidewalk. So that's always encouraging. And then two others that were identified in the plan we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and those are on further east on Dundee Road and at the north end of Sheridan Road. And getting back to the active transportation plan, the third component, the proposed improvements at crosswalks, that's kind of what led to the submittal and award of our grant funding on the Safe Routes to School. We've been talking about that for 4 years. You're probably getting tired of hearing about it, but that was awarded dollars that'll go towards key intersection improvements at school crossings at Forest Way and on Dundee and on Green Bay Road. Those improvements have been designed and are currently in final review. I think we touched on this last meeting for placement on an IDOT letting here, hopefully very shortly. The village maintains over 70 miles of sidewalk in its existing network, and this sheet from the ATP is in your packet as well. However, there are some intermittent gaps throughout the network, and there are a number of subdivisions that currently have little or no sidewalk, and I won't go over each of those specifically, but they were noted in the packet. The annual budget always includes monies earmarked for repairs and replacement to existing sidewalk, and the decision on where we replace sidewalk, got a system of evaluation and recycle through the community. In fact, we're pouring sidewalk as we speak, finishing up some work for this year's program. But we have identified locations within the ATP that are good examples of where we've got gaps in our sidewalk network. this slide shows two of the locations recommended in the plan on Dundee Road. The one on the west, on the left, has been completed, and the one on the east between Greenwood and Glencoe Drive, or even out to Green Bay Road, is not. We've got engineering underway on that, but it's a good example of, it's simple concept to say we should infill sidewalk there, but there's engineering hurdles to get over and resident buy-in to get through for a location such as that. But that's under design, and with hopefully a plan to fund and replace that sidewalk. And the other location's a little more off the beaten path. That's at the far north end of Sheridan Road, north of the Temple, this North Shore Congregation Israel, and along Lakeshore Country Club. And this is where the village's sidewalk ends, and there's a gap before you get up on Lake Cook where Highland Park sidewalk resumes or ends on their end. And this gap, not surprisingly, exists for good reason. There's a ravine crossing and an underpass at the country club. So this would be, while we think a valid connection need and a good project, it's an expensive sidewalk project. So both these two projects, staff is currently working with our consultant on grant funding options and hoping to potentially submit a project for one of the funding cycles, even as early as this fall. And then in recent months, staff has received requests again, and these are not new requests, from residents interested in working with the village to install sidewalks in neighborhoods where it currently doesn't exist. And those weren't all specifically identified in the active transportation plan, but they're generally described. And again, using the neighborhood that we talked about on the previous topic, Old Elm Lane, north of Takeoff and east of Green Bay Road, is a good example of a subdivision with minimal existing sidewalk. And so there's gaps to get back in from Green Bay Road. There's no sidewalk at either of the entry streets. There's some sidewalk interior to the subdivision. That would be a good candidate, but again, there are many hurdles with new sidewalk in areas where there is none, namely the presence of private landscaping improvements and some public tree plantings that have been allowed to grow in the right-of-way without sidewalk. And then we start looking at trying to find a corridor for a 5-foot sidewalk. Could be a bit of a challenge, and can require some significant removal, whether it's public trees or private landscape improvements. And so that's an issue as we look at some of these gaps in the system. Streets are always going to be, at least in residential neighborhoods, they're always going to be safer if we can get the pedestrians out of the street onto a public walk in the public right-of-way. In many cases, that's easier said than done. So that's those locations. So issues for consideration are going to be important if we look at a beginning to develop a policy on how we're going to address some of these locations where we're not talking replacing existing sidewalk, we're talking about the construction of new sidewalk. And some key issues would obviously be feedback from the impacted residential property owners. That's going to be essential and needs to really be sought out early before a lot of time and effort and dollars are expended even on the engineering. And then the next obvious question is, is and should those kind of improvements require the acceptance and approval, even though it's public right-of-way, of those affected properties, because there will be an impact to private improvements that are in the public right-of-way. It's a question for consideration. And then likewise, the engineering and construction costs for new sidewalk in the public right-of-way. Up till now, other than the village had a 50-50 sidewalk replacement program for several years. We've now done that for probably 10 years because we've had minimal participation in it. We've taken the tact of, we know where the existing sidewalk deficiencies are, and we budget for those. And as we've explained, if you've been on the board for any length of time, every year we come back with a sidewalk replacement contract. But for new sidewalk, is that is that cost, should all that cost be borne by the village? Should there be some participation from adjacent property owners? Similar to the street lighting issue, how subdivisions were developed without sidewalk on at least one side of the street is a puzzle. You know, even our current subdivision ordinance is very clear in there, and we do have the ability to waive sidewalk to one side only on short cul-de-sacs, but through streets, the subdivision, even the prior subdivision ordinance had a provision in there for sidewalk requirement. So, don't have a great answer for you today. The decisions that were made in many cases 40 or 50 years ago, but that's where we're at. And then I think probably as much, if not more important than approval, is what about those private improvements, the landscaping, the private improvements, walkways, retaining walls, that have over time have migrated out into the public right of way, and in some cases with village permit, some cases not, but it's still public right of way where we've got utilities and the like. Should the cost for the removal of that and or replacement, should that be borne all or partly by those private property owners, or should the village have some part in that? So this, probably more so than a street lighting issue, has more far-reaching impacts to existing property owners on residential streets where there is no walk. But from staff's perspective, I think it's been a long time coming, but it's a conversation we need to have to develop some direction, and it won't be done overnight, but we could start to build into that 10-year CIP some new sidewalk construction in addition to just the replacement of existing. And does it mean we need to see a sidewalk on both sides of the street, on every street in the village? Probably not, but we do think we've got some areas that are lacking, and depending on your perspective, if you're a longtime resident of those neighborhoods, that's what you've gotten used to. But we hear from new buyers that come into these neighborhoods all the time. This is wonderful, but where's the sidewalk? So sometimes I've given that spiel so many times I could do it in my sleep, but it begs the question, you know, what's the village's history been, but more importantly, what's our plan going forward to start addressing some of these locations. With that, I'm happy to open it up. And the problem with that, and but President Rowan, that's a good point. But the problem with the 50-50 program for new sidewalk, unless you've got, you know, buy-in from multiple neighbors, you know, that are connected right away, you know, for me to pay the cost to put 200 foot of sidewalk in front of my property that goes nowhere, you know, is hard to sell. I don't know.
I think the only thing I'd add, President Rowan, to what the Public Works Director has shared. As it relates to the active transportation plan, a lot of the discussion during the creation of that plan, and if you'll remember, that was a partnership effort between the village, the Park District, and District 35, and was spearheaded really by the Sustainability Task Force as one of its first big projects. The concept of creating a walkable community was really central to that plan. How do you get people out of cars and on their feet and on two wheels on a bike, and hence the name active transportation. And so the concepts that were discussed in that plan that I think also are relevant to this discussion, in addition to the things that Dave has mentioned, relate to how do you get folks safely to and from parks, safely to and from schools, safely to and from the village center, other transportation options, trains, bikeways, bus stops, things like that. And I think part of what needs to come out of the further analysis that staff will keep doing, and we're looking forward to board feedback tonight, is how we prioritize some of those considerations along the lines of where you add and how much you add, and where those gaps get filled in. You know, if you look at that map that Dave showed up there, a lot of the subdivision process that took place from the 30s through the 60s on the west side of town, particularly, you kind of see Skokie Ridge particularly has none. Skokie Ridge south of Dundee, that neighborhood has very little. That neighborhood was subdivided in the mid-1920s. The Skokie Ridge north of Dundee was subdivided in the 50s. And so there isn't really rhyme or reason, but those areas certainly do exist without sidewalk, and I think tied into the conversation about street lighting, in some cases are fairly dark and sidewalk free. So there may be a marriage between how we prioritize with street lighting improvements along with sidewalk improvements or not, as the case may be. But just a couple thoughts to throw out on the table as you share your feedback for us. But that active transportation plan, I think, really did help to provide some structure to these conversations as it relates to kind of the intent behind it.
Thank you. And I might ask, we talked about it, that we should identify places that seem worthy of I grew up here in something that sidewalks, and now 50, 60 years later, it didn't seem all that dangerous. There's not that much traffic. It's not so dangerous. And there are other places that you look and see they are dangerous. There's a spot on Pleasant Road, we would curb, that seems dangerous. The other stuff,
So a few things. Number one, it sounds to me like if that's true, we ought to be able to see this in the data, right? We ought to be able to look at the number of accidents and maybe go north and there to residential streets and see if there is actually a difference. We can all presume it, but that would be nice. So today,
unless we have some, on some we get some
Yeah, I would say I don't think there's much data. I don't think there's much data supporting, or I should say that I don't think there's much data indicating that accidents are happening more frequently in the neighborhoods without sidewalks. Carrie, I can't speak to that with certainty.
Most of our accidents happen on busy streets where there's
Right. Right.
Similarly, with lighting, I think data might be able to help guide us in terms of that. The other thing is I'd say is if it is about safety, I think number one is actually slowing vehicles down. So we might be able to think about ways to slow vehicles down as much as anything else. third, I think we should be thinking beyond sidewalks, right? So if it is about getting people off street, they don't necessarily have to be a sidewalk to want to walk there. It is a public right of way option, not limited as such. So maybe there are other ways, other types of pathways that would be either less expensive or more attractive for the homeowners in lieu of actual sidewalks. I recognize there's ADA issues and everything else, but there may be ways to get people off the street that landscape solution that doesn't necessarily be forced into something that must be a sidewalk. So perhaps some combination of lighting, slowing down vehicles, and inviting people to walk in these areas that don't look like front yards, right? I mean, the reality is, I think, that they often open the front yard and nobody can walk there. In fact, right away, there's some design solutions that just bring people up.
I'd like to echo some of the comments, but specifically in my career in planning and public administration, in a couple communities I've worked in, the issue of tripping hazards on sidewalks came up, and having been personally sued over that issue, I think we do a pretty good job on that, but there are actually legal firms that go out and do audits of the sidewalks and look for the cracks and any kind of accidents or slippage or falls. And so in order to manage our legal liabilities, it's important we monitor that and I think we do a pretty good job in that area, by the way, but it needs to continue. It's something that doesn't come up a lot, although in older communities it is an issue. The other thing I wanted to mention is in my neighborhood, we've got some new intersection improvements, which I think are great. I'm especially appreciative of the ADA approved approaches from the street to the sidewalk, the ramping up. I suspect that's a condition now of any grants, but it is a good thing that we do that, especially because I've been contacted over that particular issue by ARP. And they're very concerned to make sure that the ramps are wheelchair and electric chair, I'll call it, ready. And I know that we're doing that on our roads now, and that's an important ongoing issue as we move forward through the community. So thank you for that, and looking after those people. It's also make a pitch to the inclusion and community group that was mentioned by them as some of the things that they were going to investigate, I think, in the future, is the ADA accessibility in the community, and that relates to sidewalks. So thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? If not,
Just a quick one.
yeah.
So when you go to, for example, like Ocean South over here, right? So where there's a sidewalk, who owns? In my, you got the sidewalk, parkway, village owns that. How do you determine who owns what in terms of those unsidewalked streets? Does the village still own X feet?
Yeah, any of these public streets, I mean, the exception is that we're down to just, 8 or 9 private streets in town. Any of the public streets are on, or within a right-of-way that's typically, as narrow as 40 feet, but the average is 66 feet, so there's typically, as much as 12 to 15 feet of right-of-way of public land, behind the curb that has been, to Trustee Mulvaney's point, that in many cases looks to be part of somebody's front yard, and so, in many cases, this.
Neighborhoods know that.
Oh yeah, well, as a property owner, I would hope you'd know where your lot line is, but I say that.
I don't think it's commonly
Yeah.
understood necessarily how far behind the curb the right-of-way line extends, and I think it depends certainly on the street. I happen to live on a street without sidewalk, and I just came upon the lead pipe that delineates the lot line, and I had forgotten that in my neighborhood there's about 12 feet behind the curb line that is village right-of-way. And it surprised me because I said, as I visualized what a sidewalk would look like, it's pretty close to the house. So I think those are going to be components of it. Some of these neighborhoods were built in the 50s, and they were purposefully built without sidewalks, again, for reasons that we don't necessarily understand right now. And some of even our zoning requirements for setbacks, rear yard, side yard, front yard setbacks, were different. And I think that's potentially why the sidewalks don't exist, is that they were trying to squeeze more houses onto some of these lots. And I think that's going to be an aspect of this in certain areas. To Trustee Mulvaney's point, I do think it would be interesting, and we've talked about it as it relates to what is essentially the last remaining unimproved stretch of the Green Bay Trail in town, which exists between the end of Old Green Bay Road and South Avenue, right where the Hazel Crossing improvements are going to be installed. That is there a way to utilize existing right-of-way rather than constructing a new path? Could you move the curb line, widen the roadway a bit, and designate that as pedestrian and bicycle friendly rather than constructing a new path adjacent to a roadway? I think there may be some ways to look at it from that standpoint. We do run into some ADA issues, no doubt, and that is one of the struggles with programs like this, is that the ADA is a necessary component for our consideration. So some creativity with that would be necessary. But I think in those areas where sidewalks don't exist, it would be jarring to see them in some places, and trying to find a creative solution like that may be the solution that improves some of that safety. But always having a parkway, a curb, parkway, sidewalk, I think is best practice from the standpoint of the safest sidewalk, as we've talked through. And so I think you give up a little of a lot of things as you go through this prioritization process.
Well, thank you for a helpful presentation. We're going to figure this one out. To me, we should start. There are some places, fortunately, I don't think anybody's been run over yet, but there are some places where we look and think, oh, we're lucky we haven't done it. And we should try to attend to those first. And expand on.
I would ask one question, just I think it's worthwhile from our standpoint, staff standpoint, as we start to build out this and bring something back to you. Dave's question relative to private improvements in the public right-of-way. And is there a strong sense one way or another from the board as to whether how that should play into a prioritization process? And if the answer is we don't know, that's perhaps the best you can give us, but that's an aspect of this that I think staff has struggled with in terms of trying to start that process. I think primarily sidewalks. Lights are easy. Sidewalks could be, again, we could be taking down mature trees, mature plantings, driveway improvements that have been made with, pavers, irrigation systems, and then public trees. I mean, I think that's another aspect of it. There would be the loss of those too.
So we're going to have, to me, we have to see the specific, and also have to try to design around them. But I don't think, I would not be comfortable saying, oh, here's how we should do it now. But maybe, and I certainly feel like we should address it the way a lawyer, the common law would do it. Okay, look at the first one and see what's sensible, and then look at the second one and see what's sensible, and pretty soon you've got to move back. That might be a mistake. We would end up, if we came up with something, we would choke on the first implementation.
I might make one caveat to that, and that is if it's a permitted issue, if we permitted the irrigation system or we permitted the driveway improvement and the private sector made that investment, it seems to me we would be in the wrong to then come back and say, sorry, Charlie, you got to move it. Right? So it seems to me if I was prioritizing, if there were permitted projects that the homeowner took on that we approved, I don't think that we should then come back and ask them to remove them.
Just a response to that, I mean, when I reference permitting, you know, our village code requires even planting in the right of way to be reviewed and approved by the village, and I think most of it, largely 95% of what's been planted has not been reviewed and approved, and it's just been let to happen. We even without sidewalk, we don't approve permits for brick and mortar improvements in the right of way. But your point's well taken.
Sidewalks, last item on the agenda. Discussion of draft ordinance amending the village code to formalize the sustainability task force, which probably successful. Jeff,
Yes, thank you. The STF was established in 2016 by the village board. At the time, it was established by resolution. The thinking at the time was that by establishing it by resolution, it would allow the village board to have some flexibility in terms of setting the duties and the responsibilities of the STF. And since that time, I mean, let me back up. The resolution established the duties of the STF, and among them includes sponsoring awareness programs, forging alliances with other sustainability organizations, exploring grant funding, and collaborating with local organizations and sustainability initiatives. And I think it would be fair to say that this STF has succeeded on all of those fronts, and each of those things are still very important to the STF's central mission. Since the STF has been formed, though, it has solidified and has many successes, among them including it started and continues to support the annual Donate and Recycle Day. It's initiated the anti-idling campaign that continues. It's collaborated with the Glencoe Public Library on its Greener Living seminars. It advocated for a ban on gas-powered leaf blowers, which has led to the formation of a coalition of 13 local governments and advocacy groups and industry groups to discuss the ramifications of banning gas-powered leaf blowers. It has helped the village in obtaining funding for the EV station that's now in downtown. It initiated the Leave a Leave campaigns to promote healthier lawns, and they also participate in the Friends of the Green Bay Trail Day. So with those successes, it's become, we think, obvious that the resolution needs to be more formal. The STF structure needs to be more formal. Staff is recommending that to formalize the STF in an ordinance in our village code, similar to other boards and commission. We've went ahead and drafted a proposed ordinance. It mirrors mostly the Glencoe Council for Inclusion in Communities ordinance that was proposed last year. And then it repeats the same goals and objectives of the STF that were outlined in the original resolution. Those are still as relevant today as they were when the STF was formed in 2016. So tonight, we'd like to hear any feedback that you have about more formally recognizing the STF and including it into the village code. And as noted, our chairman, Barney Gallagher, is also here tonight, and he can help answer any questions that you may have.
Before we talk, Mr. Gallagher is here. Do we need to swear him in? Or can we just...
No, this is not a public hearing.
There you go. Mr. Gallagher, is there anything you want to add probably, you know, probably our preaching to the choir, but if it's a
I guess the only thing that I would add to Jeff's remarks is that I think by formalizing in ordinance fashion, it serves to recognize the, you know, the long-term implications that these issues have for the village. And it says, yeah, we recognize this isn't going away, so we need to do something permanent about it. And I think that's important.
anybody want to?
I have one is task force what it should be called going forward? Should it be called a commission or something other than just a task force?
Can I address that?
Please.
We would prefer to keep it the task force because we've spent a lot of energy on brand recognition.
Then do it. Just asking.
I would say we all owe the task force volunteers some gratitude and thanks. So Barney, thank you for leadership, and please pass on to the group the board's appreciation for all the efforts that they've made and the time that they've donated.
Absolutely. Okay. So we would take this to the village board.
Right. If the village board tonight doesn't have any thoughts or ideas to change anything that's been presented, and I'm sorry, the format of the ordinance got a little wonky in the packet, we would then present this for the board's consideration at the September board meeting, and then it would be codified at that point.
Seems right, and, you know, except for Jeff's description that you just mirrored what we did for community inclusion, that makes sense. And again, people are trusting what they said. Thank you to you and your team. We're going to work the village a little better for doing this, and we want to keep going. Okay. Is there any other business that any member of the board would like to discuss in committee of the whole? If not, is there a motion to adjourn?
No motion. I had one quick thing I wanted to put on the table for future discussion, and that is the idea, I think I've brought this up maybe once before, I'm not certain, of the board taking it upon ourselves to do some reflection and carving out time on a periodic basis to evaluate the performance of the board, review some of our past decisions, much like we would do for any employee on an annual basis, rank, we don't have to necessarily rank ourselves, but take the time to look at some of the key decisions we've made over time and see how we're doing and see what we can learn, and make sure we pass those lessons learned onto the next board so that's stronger than the past. I'm just asking if we might consider that in some future format.
I'm not opposed to this, I'm just trying to think. Congress doesn't do it.